Excellent. I don't know if I'm supposed to wait for Guillaume or just keep going.
Sorry, this is me. I'm talking.
You want to talk into the microphone?
Yeah, the microphone. Just go collapse later. Sorry, we're also responding to like urgent ministerial things right now as things go in our world.
Yes.
Thanks for putting up with us, mainly me. So we, as we've talked about, through Open Source Advisory Board and all of the work that we're doing, we really think about rules, tools, and people components. And people have been one of the, how do we manage the capacity? So even to my comment previously of just, there's so many people that are here today and interested, how do we leverage and maximize that output? And so one of the reasons why we wanted to have the Open Source Advisory Board be both private sector and public sector was so that we could really learn from how the private sector has been doing great work. Mike told me earlier that he's like, we don't really have KPIs, but we're a $3 billion company, so like we're doing something, right? So I think that we have a lot to learn from Red Hat, and they've been excellent contributors on the Open Source Advisory Board, and so we invited them here to speak today about their culture within Red Hat, and we're really looking forward to hearing more. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you for that introduction. Wow. So I will be talking about culture today, a journey to open. But I'm also going to talk about, some of the reasons why open source innovation actually works at a deeply human level, and culture is all about humans, right? And how we behave and how we approach to doing innovation, how we work together. And so I have some accumulated information from research that I've done personally by actually looking at some other companies, also looking at literature, and actually getting down to actual research done by researchers who understand how humans interrelate and innovate together. But first of all, I just want to thank Ashley and Guillaume and Mark Berard for inviting us and bringing an advisory council together. We've been pushing an open source mandate, Red Hat being all open source, for many years, and I'm really glad that this is happening now. And I have been accused of being a futurist throughout my 10 years as strategist. But today is truly a remarkable day, and I don't want to lose sight of that, because today sort of symbolizes this transition and evolution of government to facilitate this opportunity in front of us for like nonprofits, for-profits, the individual constituents to actually actively participate in government. And I see examples of this, and I'm very proud of you guys, but I'm also very proud of the province of British Columbia that has been very, very progressive in terms of how they approach open source and the way they look at government and how it fundamentally operates. I think for really the first time, in many ways, we're starting to see the evolution of, I hear the term open government here, it means many things to many people, but we're at the precipice now of allowing the constituents, being nonprofits, for-profits, and individual citizens, actively contribute and participate in governance. Right? And government at the end of the day is just collective civic action to solve problems more effectively than doing it on an individual basis. So I'm really excited. I'm a big government as a platform advocator. I'm a big government 2.0, open government, whatever terminology you want to use. And by adopting open source, that is a huge main vehicle for harnessing the open source capacity and diversity that we have. There are 33 million open source contributors worldwide innovating together. So I applaud you for that. So today, as I said, I'm going to be talking about how this culture evolves, what the open source look like. I'm going to use examples of our company, and one of my KPIs that you already mentioned, Ashley, is the fact that we can generate $3 billion worth of revenue through a complete open source model. I think that's a great way to measure success. Not the only way, but I think it's, if it works for us, I think it can work for government in general. And I'll build up the slide to save some time. We are a big company around understanding our why. Fundamentally, we believe open unlocks the world's potential. And in the public sector, we would say to improve the lives of citizens. We believe being open and all the values and beliefs of open are very, very important. And as you embark on this journey to convince those in power, those who are your leaders, convince your peers and comrades on what open source means, you've got to understand a few of these values of what open source actually means. It means, and Ashley, you just talked about participation. Look, people, Open source is about participation. It's the creation of communities. It's about, putting passion toward the things that you do. It's not just open source technology and source code. It's really, as Dr. Friedman said this morning, about participation, about transparency, and it's about what we call meritocracy within our organization. Meritocracy came from the ancient Athenians. It's the concept that the best idea wins no matter what. And that really, when you look at open source, and we live and die in the open source communities that eventually become Red Hat products, and there is a tremendous amount of what I would call peer review. Being a physicist, I was always worried about peer review, right? Because my peers would find an inconsistency in what I'm saying. They point it out. And the same is true with an open source, and that's why it takes a lot of courage for you to actually expose yourself, your open source, your source code, or if you're a contributor in other ways to the world, because it's going to be scrutinized. And then in a hierarchical kind of organization, that can be a challenge. But we really feel that our strength is the fact that our culture is based on open source. Our company is open source. Like, it is open source from top to bottom. I don't know if people follow Simon Sinek in the room. He's kind of a thought leader out there, and he's a big guy around trust. He wakes up every morning because he wants people to wake up feeling inspired to go to work, provide a meaningful value contribution to whatever the mission is of that entity, that group, and to feel fulfilled when they went home. And he also is a big advocate of trust. And trust, he says, is a distinctly human emotion. It arises when you surround your people that share the same beliefs and values that you do. And this is very, very important when it comes to open source, because as I said before, it takes courage to throw yourself out there and to be open. And so looking at what he also says, he says, if you're going to be an open source and you're going to move forward and experiment, and a lot of the movements we're seeing nowadays that are sort of with DevOps, with open source is the DevOps movement, right? This thing that we don't necessarily know where the destination is. We have a problem statement, but we're not sure how we're going to get there. It takes a lot of experimentation, and experimentation inherently means failure. Okay? And I love the lady downstairs this morning with the keynote where she said, we failed doing this, and we failed doing that, Failure has to become something that you accept. And I remember talking to a customer in Montreal, and he says, to start this thing of blameless culture and being open and taking the courage to step up and try things and experiment and possibly fail, they had these meetings where every person in the company had to stand up in front of the group and say, what was your biggest failure at this company? Right? And so when we look at building a culture, being open and transparent, it's not easy. Like, this is going to be a bit of an embarkment. I know within Red Hat, we fully embrace it. We have a lot of discussions within Red Hat as we go through and take the source bits of the open source community and productize it so that it's consumable by the enterprise, it's predictable, you're protected, and some of the things that Luke talked about this morning. So to formulate trust is a human emotion, and you got to have shared values and beliefs. And that's why I talk about open source, those values and beliefs that go with open source today. And DevOps kind of lives the open source style. It's kind of like this new culture that you also have to think about, right? It's really about the people. The technology is pretty straightforward. I think as technologists, and I think we're all technologists in the room, like we really do focus on technology. No technology? Okay. So it's really about the culture, the people, and the process. And this whole DevOps movement really sprung out of the open source kind of world, right? It was this thing that DevOps kind of lives the open source lifestyle, if you will. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that and reflect on why open source works in a DevOps context. And one of the things that came out of some studies done by Dr. Goldratt that I have up here, he said that within organizations, and why open source is actually solving a lot of these problems, is there's this thing called the core chronic conflict. And this happens when you have two groups within an organization that are at diametrically opposing odds or goals. They have different views or philosophies in the world. And in IT, the context is typically, we boil it down to development and down to operations, right? The developers who are trying to move fast, get things into production, meet the business need, and then you got the people in operations who are focused on keep the thing up and running, make it predictable, make sure it's secure, and it will, those are two different sort of approaches or philosophies in terms of how they do their jobs. We need to break that down. And when you look at open source is based on meritocracy. It's based on peer review, right? You have to work together to agree to come to an endpoint. And so the DevOps principles, this is Gene Kim, who's actually one of the forefathers of DevOps. People know Gene Kim. He wrote the Phoenix Project. Yeah. So a lot of the tooling within a DevOps perspective is open source based tooling. And at the high level, these are the three core principles that are around DevOps. One is fast flow. That's the top part of this picture. We have development on one side. You can think of that like an assembly line. You can think of it as we call it the technology value stream in DevOps speak. This is going from the idea a developer has or a business person has. They turn it into a hypothesis. It gets encoded, and it goes through the application lifecycle, through the various testing environments to production. So you're trying to maximize that flow. That's what you're trying to do in DevOps. You're trying to break down the barriers. That one barrier I just talked about between development and operations. How do you do that? Well, you form little teams. We can only really effectively talk to 10 people, like all the time, and get things done. 10 is typically the maximum. It's just the way we are. It's the way we're built. And that's why you see a lot of DevOps shops will have small teams, but those people in that team will understand development. They'll understand a little bit about ops, or vice versa. They'll understand a little bit about the business. They'll understand a little bit about testing. They'll understand a little bit about security. And so we're building these teams to break down that barrier that I just talked about, the fundamental barrier that we have in a waterfall kind of application lifecycle program. We're also sending little bits of change, little innovations all the time on a daily basis. I have a customer in TELUS that does 500 deploys per day to production. So if you buy anything from TELUS on the consumer site, they're doing 500 deploys to production a day. Like it's fast, 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 fast. So they're doing small little incremental changes. If there's a problem, they can back it out really easily. But most of the time, it's going right to production. They do tens of thousands of deploys to the various supporting environments. You're also trying to make things visible. We live in an invisible workplace, right? Technology, you can't walk, like in a manufacturing line, you can't walk down and, like in manufacturing where you see inventory build up and people not doing their job. Like, this is invisible. So we need to make things visible so we understand where the cues are in the application lifecycle so that we can address those and fix them and scrum them as we see slowdown. So that's kind of that first grand principle, if you will, principle number one. The middle part, the dev and the ops and kind of that loop, that talks around feedback loops. Most of the systems we've built today in IT are very tightly coupled, and no one person understands the system from beginning to end. So we need to create a safe system above it, a human system, an open source-like approach to doing innovation. And this is the feedback loop. So you're trying to figure out every time there's a problem, how do you fix the problem? You share it globally, and that comes down to the last principle at the bottom where you're sharing and experimenting throughout the entire innovation lifecycle. And most of the things that you see here, the tooling, the automated tooling that some people were just talking about are living in the DevOps world. And so just to summarize, we have fast flow, we got feedback loops, constant learning, experimentation. So as I look to explain culture, there's various definitions of culture. I'm not talking like music culture and, we're talking about culture, how it applies to performance of a group. And Dr. Robert Westroom studied a number of different types of culture. And he looked at it, and he was looking at the ultimate measure of performance of a culture or a group. And he was looking at life and death situations. He studied everything from ER rooms to whatever. And he came up with this definition of culture. Culture is defined to be the organization's pattern of response to problems and opportunities. So how does the organization react to that? And this is a paper that he put out. And what he found was the safety culture, the culture that actually helps and understands how the system works, if you can build that through conscious inquiry, is the actual terms he used, he says the flow of information is the most critical part of defining a high-performance organization. Right? So getting the right information to the right person at the right time. And when we look at open source is about openness. It's about building communities, sharing all the time. It's about building advanced communication mechanisms that aren't email. They're typically Slack or other very fast communication mechanisms. Small teams, so communication's happening all the time. So looking at high-performance organizations by adopting an open source approach to innovations and how you group and the philosophies how you innovate will drive a high-performance organization. So high-performance organization is a result typically of an open source approach to methodologies. And he also used the flow of information as the way to look at different cultures and categorize them. On the left, you have the pathological. In the middle, you have the bureaucratic. And I think most of the people in the room would probably look at themselves and think, yeah, I'm probably bureaucratic, not just in public sector, but private sector. And on the far right is what he calls the generative culture. So depending on how the information flows throughout the organization, you'll have different performance, but they'll treat information differently. The pathological information or organization will look at information as an asset to advance their careers. It's not shared, it's hidden, it's not open, it's not transparent, right, against the open source principles. In the bureaucratic organization, you're typically focused on a group, not the mission of the organization. It is focused on making the group look good. You use rules and policies to communicate. There's formalized channels to communicate, right? I think we all sort of fall into that category within the room, versus the generative organization that will get the right information to the right person at the right time, go through back channels if they need to in order to do that. So information flows. And the leaders of the organization define the culture. So the leaders need to have the symbolic gestures. They need to have the incentives for organizations to behave a certain way. The people within the organization form the culture. So we need to find leaders like Alex Benet who stand up and say, we're going to work this way now, right? And we're going to drive open source through the organization. And so I applaud the efforts of TBS for doing this. And sort of open source is kind of like Dr. McChrystal, who talks about teams of teams. How do you, as I said before, you can only really have effective communication with about 10 people all the time. Sure, you can maybe get up to 100, that's the Dodd's limit, but you're not having effective communications. You go from the command style, which is the upper left-hand corner, to command of teams, and that's typically where the next part of the journey goes when I look at organizations on the open source journey. And then eventually they get to teams of teams, which is in some ways what it looks like within Red Hat, right? Everybody's in small teams. They're all part of an open source community. They're participating. They know somebody from maybe one of the other communities, and that information is shared amongst the groups, but the groups formalize and crystallize into smaller teams that look like that. And that is a good read. He talks about many principles that he used for the Marines within the U.S. and how they organize themselves, again, which creates a culture. Conway's Law we talked about a little bit today. I'm surprised, something I usually talk about, but it's the communication structure, the way the groups in the organization communicate, what that structure looks like. I'm not talking about the org chart, right? There's always groups within our organizations that are critical and they are focused on one part. And the way that communication structure looks, like you see here in the sort of the top, the small distributed teams, if you have an organization that looks like that, it will drive a software architecture on the right-hand side. So if you look at open source, in the most far extreme nowadays, you have massive amounts of people in the open source world who are building loosely coupled software, which is good, right? Tightly coupled software, you make a change, you have no idea when it goes through that whole system to production on what's going to happen to it. If you make it loosely coupled, meaning you can make a change to part of it, it should not impact the other part. And that's why open source has been so successful. And if you've read books like by Linus Torvald and others around the church and the bazaar, that gives you a sense of what open source is all about. Nowadays, I talk to most public sector and private sector organizations. They're trying to get to the small distributed teams, kind of these DevOps teams, multi-discipline teams. They work together to form these little groups, and they produce, today the current term is microservices architecture. People heard that? All right. I was part of the architectural framework committee, the previous CIO, and I got up in front of everybody and said, we got to start thinking about a microservices architecture. And the ADM at that point said, wow, what is that, right? And now I'm seeing people saying microservices, which is great. That's a very loosely coupled system as well, which creates a safe system of work, which makes all our lives a lot easier from a work-life balance. Most of the organizations, I think, today in applications are at the bottom. We got large collated teams, we got waterfall methodologies, and we got monolithic architectures that we either need to start to break apart to create loosely coupled systems, and open source will cause that. So you got that, right? The way you structure the organization reflects what the architecture of your software is. So effectively, you're solving two problems. At work every day, we talk about three things only, maybe four. Three things: the problem domain. What is the problem? What's the problem we're trying to solve? We're talking about the system, right? The system is the application or whatever the service, digital service that you're creating. And the third is the people and how you organize. And those three areas we're talking about when we create an open source kind of culture. Google did a project to understand what creates a high-performance organization. And they looked at 600 teams around the world. And they're trying to figure out, what does it make? What's it make up a good high-performance team? And they thought, oh, maybe it's you put a bunch of smart people together, right? Or maybe you figure out all the skills required to solve the problem, put those people together. And they struggled. They couldn't find anything until they came across this report at the bottom by Woolley et al. From the Carnegie Mellon. And in there, I can't believe this, in that particular paper, they were looked at what creates a high-performance team through a psychiatrist or a psychologist lens. And they actually came up with the idea that there's this idea of collective intelligence of the group. And anyway, it took psychiatrists and psychologists, a few hundred years to figure out there's a collective intelligence. Like, don't they watch Star Trek, right, with the Borg, with the collective intelligence? But this was the first time that they actually proved that there is a collective intelligence, okay? Up to 2009, the psychiatry was focused on individual intelligence. So they put a whole bunch of people in a room, they gave them a bunch of cognitive tasks that the group needed to correct, and what they found was there was three main factors. Number one, there was no correlation between the average or the maximum intelligence of the group members, right? Put a bunch of smart people together, no, they don't solve the problem as fast as these other groups. The three main factors were, how often do people talk when they're solving the problem? How many members of the group actively participate? And when Ashley stood up in front of you and said, look, we need your participation, this is why. We solve problems faster. So effectively, if 80% of the group was actively participating all the time, they completed the cognitive tasks much faster. Number two was this idea of social empathy, I think the word they use. So that's my ability to understand how you feel when I throw out an idea. And do I feel confident that you're not going to say, what are you talking about, Mike, right? And challenge me. And so those groups that had social empathy, more groups, and they actually have a test that you can do online, by the way. If you want to measure your own social empathy within your teams, you could do that. Those ones did better. And the last factor, and for the ladies in the room, the number of women in the group drove better cognitive skills of the collective intelligence of the group. And so Project Aristotle saw this paper and they said, oh, we're going to go through all the data, and they came up with these 5 things. Psychological safety, okay, it was number 1. Refers to an individual's perception of the consequences of taking interpersonal risk. Do I feel comfortable sharing an idea without being ridiculed effectively, okay? And then there's these other important factors as well, as kind of related back to what I talked about with Simon Sinek. Am I making an impact to the organization? Do I believe in the purpose of what I'm working for? And do I share the same values and beliefs of the people beside me? Okay? So when I talked about psychological safety, I talked about people sharing, right? These are all open source kind of principles that we need to abide by. These are the founding principles of open source. And if you look at us, this is kind of our open source culture. We're engaging communities. We are obviously believe in open standards. We completely believe shared problems are solved faster. I mean, we debate everything on Red Hat. I mean everything. And if it's not brought up, it will be brought up. We have a mailing list. Do you guys have mailing lists still? Mailing list called Memo List within our group, within the company. And you can basically say anything that's not, you can't go across the line with regards to HR or legal things. But you can say pretty much anything you want. We hired a brand new CIO, and there was a bunch of chatter like, who's this guy? What does he know about open source? Literally, like, can you imagine that? You guys get a new ADM, and they say, who's this guy? Does he know how to run his job? We actually live the open source lifestyle. And so there's many ways of doing that, but open source policy is something obviously you need. Somebody said this morning in one of the keynotes, like, you can't live in the complete open source world, right? You have certain legal boundaries. You have the fact that you're a government, right? You need to work and understand what those boundaries are. But there's nothing stopping you from organizing yourselves according to an open source methodology. There might be stuff that prevent you from doing certain activities, but definitely there's an opportunity. If you want to understand how an open source company works, that is the book. Jim Whitehurst, who's our CEO, wrote the book on the open organization, and you will learn a lot in that book, and I would highly recommend it. We've shifted from the left side, which is a conventional organization, command and control, decisions at the top, right? And that gets sent down to the rank and file, and then the people at the bottom of this, on the left-hand side, the people like you and I that are, working. Why do we work there? A lot of it in the traditional organization is based on promotion and pay, which effectively you could say is manipulation, right? We all have to make a living and make money and support our families, but we're not there necessarily for our passionate purpose in life, right? We're not aligned to why we exist. On the right-hand side is the bottom-up organization, which Jim talks about in the book. So his job at the top, he would say, is motivating and inspiring. So we literally spend $500 million a year having our engineers participate in the OpenShift community. And his purpose and leadership's purpose is to create purpose and passion. We all volunteer for certain things outside of work, right? We do that because we're passionate. We believe in the cause. We believe in the values of whatever that organization is. That's what you want within your company or within the public sector. You want people waking up inspired and be passionate about what they do. The middle part's where it gets done, though. I talked about meritocracy and best idea wins, but on the right side, let the sparks fly. The spark does fly. When Jim first joined us from Delta Airlines, and he's a strategist like myself, he came in and did the usual 30, 60, 90-day assessment of the organization, brought in a third party, his old Boston Consulting Group, and they said, this is the way it's going to be. And all his lieutenants looked him straight in the eye and said, no, that doesn't work. Literally, can you imagine? Somebody coming in of that power and rank, and everybody says, no, we're not going to do it that way, Jim. And this is why. Of course, there's always a follow-up reason why, but that's effectively how we work. So you need to start thinking about this. Because we live in the open source world, you're giving up some control. From our perspective, although we're in the trenches building the software that you guys are consuming throughout the federal government and making decisions on your behalf, or at least influencing the decisions to build software, you're giving up a little bit of control of strategy, right? If the community decides that it wants to follow Google on Kubernetes versus what Red Hat's doing in Kubernetes versus what Microsoft, right? You know, we're kind of at the whim, and it's up to us as leaders and leaders at the bottom of the pyramid here, right? The base of the pyramid on the right, to make those decisions and drive that. So a lot of leaders do go through an existentialist moment. What's my role within the company? If all of a sudden the frontline workers probably know best for the organization do their work, they have to figure out what they need to do. They need to read this book and understand how to nurture that passion. So people come to work not for pay and benefits. They come because they want to change the world and make it better. So I will talk briefly about open source development. Peter Watkins from the BC Dev Exchange. And I would highly recommend everybody in the room look at bcdevexchange.org and go to that site. I know you guys copied their website, GC Dev Exchange, I think it's called up here now with the feds. He went in and said there's 3 things you need to do if you really want to be open source. Number 1, you got to figure out a community. What are you passionate about? What do you want to solve? What's your problem? And we all work in the Westminster style of ministries. We have our own mandates. If you can find something that you're passionate about, find that community. Join the community, right? And don't sit back and suck down the software bits from the community. Actively participate within the community. And so BC Dev Exchange.org, they've actually said, these guys are smart. They said, oh, there's 33 million people out there in the world developing software. Some of the best software on the planet. In fact, most of the mega technology trends, you could argue, are all open source originated, right? And he says, oh, I can tap into that. I can tap into that capacity. And so they released, as of 3 weeks ago, the lady earlier here was talking about the people problem, finding people that can actually do this. They said, well, we'll just tap into this community. There's a huge amount of community. So they just released problem statements to the market, right? Either internally or to our external parties and say, this is our problem. We have a fentanyl problem. People are dying. You know, how can you propose to fix this? And they post the problem statement, not the requirements and the usual RFP process that we all go through. They post the problem, and they put a reward or compensation upwards of now $1.7 million per award, and they hire DevOps teams either from within the ministries themselves or external parties or both, and the DevOps team slowly work toward the solution to that problem, an iterative DevOps approach. That is a fundamental transformation of government, right? That is active participation by the for-profits, the nonprofits, and the constituency in building digital services to solve problems like the fentanyl app. So I highly don't stop and navel gaze, guys. Literally build a community, define where it is, get active participation. Don't wait for TBS to get the policy figured out. Build them. Go to GitHub, figure out from your bot. Just do it. It doesn't take a lot to get going. And use bcdevexchange.org as a model. They're a couple years ahead of what you're doing. The U.S. federal government had a problem. I think a lot of organizations in the public sector are losing some of the people like me. I don't have as much gray hair. I guess I look young for my age. But there's a lot of people leaving the organization that have a lot of tacit knowledge, and they needed to figure out how do we get the new people coming in and get the knowledge out of the older people that are about to retire. And so they looked at open source as a way to do that, because when you participate and build stuff in open source, it leaves the brain and it goes to a GitHub, right? It's all there. If you properly document it, it's all there. And they also said, look, we're going to look at automation. We're going to figure out how do we automate everything. I mean, nobody goes on a keyboard to configure an asset, whether it's a network switch, a server, whether it's an application, okay, coding maybe, you're allowed to type and put it into a GitHub repo. But get it all out there into a recipe, a playbook, as we call it, and Ansible is the technology that they used, which happens to be a Red Hat asset, and facilitate automation. So everything comes out of the brains, allows the new people and the old people to get together, and you can share and have the knowledge based in these playbooks that you rerun all the time. So it's a very effective way of doing that. You can look at that piece that's written on the internet. Finding people is really hard, right? Who are looking for people? Who are leaders looking for people to hire people? Anybody? It is hard to find people. And we've been running this intern program with the University of Toronto. We're looking for two things. And a lot of my business partners and my private sector guys are saying, I want somebody with the right aptitude. They're smart, okay? Number two, they have the right attitude. They want to be open, transparent, they're a team player, they're collaborative. And we run this intern program for many years at Red Hat. The first it's a 16-month program. We hire people between years 3 and 4. Usually affiliated with the university. In our case, we get a lot from U of T. I'm starting to get people from Waterloo. The first 2 weeks, they go through new hire orientation. We might want to think about a boot camp, Ashley, where we say, new hire orientation, or I'm not sure what to call it, but you are indoctrinated to the open source principles and how it works as soon as you come in. They're assigned immediately to a project, some open source project, maybe an open source community. They're treated like full-time employees, like they get everything, right? They're integrated from the teams from the beginning. They're allowed to make mistakes. They're 40 hours remote. We feed them with opportunities, build a sense of community, and we give them the option for continuing to work with us moving forward. So these intern programs, and I'm on a personal vendetta to get open source and particularly Red Hat-based open source technologies into the universities and colleges across Canada. And I'm driving that mandate within Red Hat Canada because everybody's screaming for open source people. I know we talked about Seneca having a complete open source program available that they graduate people. Luke talked a little bit about this earlier. It's a bit of a sales message, but I will tell you, I've been through this journey with many customers, including public sector, especially public sector. It's really hard to pick up a book and do. And we can talk about best practices, Ashley. We can talk about, getting teams together and trying to figure this out on our own. It is really hard unless you've lived the open source lifestyle. You will get there, but I'm telling you, make an investment in what we call the Open Innovation Labs. We teach you how to do the open source way. This came out of the top executives within our customers around the world, the big guys, the multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies. We asked them, what do you need from Red Hat? And they said, teach us the open source innovation model. Show us how to do that. And that's where this comes in. Typically 2 4-week sprints. We build a minimum viable product. We teach you how to work in the open source communities, right? And we get you going and flying. We've done this for a number of government entities in Ontario, and it's been a tremendous success. And it looks like I'm out of time, right? So last slide. Think about the Open Innovation Lab. It is a 2 4-week sprint. You get a product at the end of it. We teach you the open source way. Believe me, these guys, if you said waterfall to them, they would say, oh, I've been to Niagara Falls. Right? They have no idea. They're all startups from Silicon Valley. If you want to reach with me, I do a lot of articles. I'd be happy to share some of the content I have today, the articles, if you want to reach out on social media. So fortunately, I don't know if I got any time for questions, do I? Yeah.
You'll be around?
Yes, I'll be around. My plane got delayed, so I'll be around a lot longer than I thought I was going to be. So, thank you.